Vietnam? A noble cause? A shameful venture? This television series looks back on a hard chapter in America's history. 2.5 million Americans fought in Vietnam, and 58,000 Americans died there. Why? America's war in Vietnam lasted 15 years, but the Vietnamese have known war a long time, more than 2,000 years. Their traditional enemy was China, their giant neighbor to the north. For centuries, Vietnam was the southernmost part of China's empire. The Vietnamese absorbed Chinese culture and customs, but they never accepted Chinese rule. Today, throughout Vietnam, they commemorate the Trung sisters, who led a rebellion against China in the 1st century after Christ. The rebellion failed, but the Trung sisters are still heroines, part of a long line of Vietnamese who fought foreign domination.
Our history, from the time of the Hung Kings and the Trung sisters to the era of President Ho Chi Minh, has been a history of great struggle. Throughout history, the Vietnamese people have always done their best to defend the country and to build the nation.
They fought for almost 1,000 years after the Trungs to evict the Chinese. Then they pushed south to their present borders, conquering other peoples in their path. The country expanded so rapidly that it fragmented in a series of civil wars. Despite their internal conflicts, the Vietnamese regarded themselves as one country and one people. But they were too weak and divided to fight off the conquering Europeans in the 19th century. Around 1860, the French seized the area near Saigon. They took over central and northern Vietnam during the next 2 decades, and by 1885, Vietnam had once again lost its independence. French Indochina at the end of the 1880s. Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, which the French divided into 3 regions: Cochin China, Annam, and Tonkin. To the Vietnamese, the division was a deliberate attempt to destroy their national unity. The Vietnamese resisted. The French called all resistors pirates, and they sent in the troops for the first pacification of Vietnam. They staged public executions. The severed heads were photographed and printed on postcards which soldiers sent home to sweethearts in Paris with kisses from Hanoi. It took 20 years to get the Vietnamese resistance under control. Then the French could concentrate on the economics of colonialism, trying to transform Vietnam into a source of profit.
The people here suffered a lot because of high taxes and hard forced labor. They worked from dawn till dusk, but they did not have enough to eat.
The cheap labor profited a few French companies, even though Indochina was a financial sinkhole. The French nation spent millions of francs each year to protect and support the colony, while French companies like Michelin Rubber made millions in profits from factories and plantations. There were no major uprisings during these hard years. Vietnamese society was reeling under the impact of westernization. French culture permeated the cities, bringing Western fashions and ideas. The Vietnamese elite began to give their sons a Western education. Almost all of those who would lead the next resistance to the French were French educated. Among them was Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh's early years are difficult to trace. He was always mysterious about himself, giving few interviews, and preferring in later life to present himself as the benevolent Uncle Ho. Ho was born about 1890 as Nguyen Tat Tan, the son of an official who resigned rather than serve under the French. As a young man, Ho left his country, working as a ship hand and cook in America, Britain, and France. In 1917, Ho moved to Paris. He took the pseudonym Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen the Patriot, and began to agitate for Vietnam's independence. He tried to plead his cause at the Versailles Conference following World War I, but was not admitted. His effort made him famous among the Vietnamese in France. In 1920, Nguyen Ai Quoc became a founding member of the French Communist Party, the first Vietnamese communist. The communists sent him to Moscow for training in 1923. He traveled widely, organizing expatriate Vietnamese into a revolutionary party. Reports during the next 17 years placed him in Germany, China, Thailand, France, Russia. France was proud of its colonial record.
Dans de nombreuses régions, autrefois désertiques, où des tribus hostiles les unes aux autres traînaient une existence misérable, les civilisateurs français ont apporté la paix, le travail, la prospérité, la joie. Par son importance et sa fécondité, le domaine français d'outre-mer est devenu un élément essentiel de la vie économique mondiale, une force active de la civilisation, un glorieux témoignage de la grandeur de la France.
1940 brought the end to this grandeur of France. Japan, pursuing its conquest of China, wanted to block the transport of war materiel through Vietnam. In June 1940, 3 days after France fell to Nazi Germany, Japan demanded the right to land forces in Indochina. Japan's arrival deeply impressed the Vietnamese. Asians like themselves had overthrown the European colonials, for it was clear who was in charge. The Japanese supported several Vietnamese nationalist groups, but other groups were both anti-French and anti-Japanese. The most important was the Viet Minh, founded in 1941 by Nguyen Ai Quoc. He had returned to Vietnam after 30 years with a new name, Ho Chi Minh, meaning he who enlightens.
After the conference to establish the Viet Minh, Uncle Ho sent out a letter calling for the support of the population. And it was this that rallied the entire country around the movement. And when people realized that Ho Chi Minh was actually Nguyen Ai Quoc, their trust in the movement was further established. This was because the name Nguyen Ai Quoc had been widely known in the country. People knew that he was a great patriot.
The Viet Minh organized guerrilla bases, trained cadres, harassed the French and Japanese, and spread propaganda, urging the peasants to resist.
Why did the Viet Minh fight the Japanese while other Asian nationalists collaborated?
I apologize, but this is a very funny question. At that time, the Japanese had already overthrown the French and begun to dominate our country. So of course we had to fight the Japanese.
By early 1945, Vietnam was suffering a terrible famine. People blamed the French and Japanese, who were hoarding rice, feeding it to Japanese troops, and even exporting it to Japan, while an estimated 2 million Vietnamese out of 8 million in the northern areas died.
Lên đến Hà Nội lúc bấy giờ đó, chúng tôi tính giờ là vào khoảng độ.
At that time, in our estimate, at least 40,000 starving, poor peasants arrived in Hanoi
Lên đến Hà Nội để đi xin ăn,
to beg for food
để
and to wait for handouts, for alms.
bố thí cho. Pháp thì nó không tổ chức
The French did not organize any hunger relief,
tổ chức cứu đói cho nhân dân.
and the Japanese specifically forbade us to carry out any hunger relief effort of our own.
Là ở các phố thì bà con là bới những các cái đống
People
rác
dug into the
để
garbage
tìm
dumps in
tất
order
cả
to
cái
find
gì có
any
thể ăn
edible
được.
thing at all.
Rồi sau đó đến
They
có
also
một
ate
cái
rats,
nghĩa là bắt chuột mà ăn, nhưng mà cũng
but this
không
was not enough to keep them alive.
sống được.
The Viet Minh organized the peasants to seize rice stocks and gain tremendous prestige. This peasant support gave them a political edge they never lost.
It's a long, tough road to Tokyo. It's longer to go to Tokyo than it is to Berlin, in every sense of the word. The defeat of Germany will not mean the end of the war against Japan.
As the war in Europe drew to a close, Allied attention turned to Asia and the war against Japan. One of the pressing needs was intelligence.
As essential as the defeat of Germany.
The Viet Minh believed Allied statements supporting the rights of oppressed peoples. They had given the Allies information about Japanese troop movements. So the Americans turned to the Viet Minh and its leader, Ho Chi Minh.
I first met Ho on the China border between China and Indochina in the last days of April of 1945. He was quite an interesting individual, very sensitive, very gentle, a rather frail type. We spoke quite at length about the general situation, not only in Indochina, but the world at large.
We knew he was a communist, but we also felt, as they did, and the way anybody who has met Ho Chi Minh that I've ever talked with had the same feeling, he was first a nationalist and second a communist. That is, he was interested in getting the independence of his people, and then he thought probably the best thing for them was the communist type of government. But he was a nationalist first and foremost.
The Viet Minh agreed to help the Allies. Major Patty sent a training group, the Deer Mission, into the northern mountains.
The Deer team went in and they organized out of about 500 Vietnamese. We selected, with the help of General Giap, selected 200. We spent the next 4 weeks training these young men into the art of using automatic weapons, demolition equipment, and the infiltrating and exfiltrating into various dangerous areas. There, for the first time, we saw what kind of troops the Viet Minh were. They were very willing, fine, young nationalists, really what we used to say gung-ho type. They were willing to risk their lives for their cause, the cause of independence against the French.
Before Ho's men could prove their willingness, World War II was over. The sudden Japanese collapse took many in French Indochina by surprise, but the Viet Minh were ready for what they called the August Revolution. Declaring Vietnam independent, they marched in to take Hanoi peacefully. Ho Chi Minh formed a government in Hanoi, carefully mixing in members of other nationalist groups. But in the south, away from Ho's moderating influence, his followers started purging rival nationalists. Still with the Viet Minh, and perhaps reinforcing the idea of American support, was the OSS.
2 or 3 days after I met Ho, he asked me to come in and stop in and see him, at which time he wanted to show me something. And what he wanted to show me was a draft of the Declaration of Independence that he was going to declare several days later. Of course, it was in Vietnamese and I couldn't read it, and when it was interpreted to me, I was quite taken aback to hear the words of the American Declaration of Independence. Words about liberty and life and the pursuit of happiness, etc. I just couldn't believe my own ears.
On September 2nd, 1945, on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan formally surrendered. And on the same day throughout Vietnam, the Vietnamese celebrated their self-proclaimed Independence Day and the formation of a new country, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. In Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh read a speech that began, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights."
Vì vậy đó, đến khi mà Hồ Chủ tịch lên lễ đài đó,
I can say that the most moving moment was when President Ho Chi Minh climbed the steps
lần đầu
and the
tiên
national anthem was
mà
sung.
quốc ca Việt Nam
It was the first time that the national anthem of Vietnam was sung in an official ceremony.
thế rồi bác
Uncle Ho then read the Declaration of Independence, which was a short document.
thế thì đang
As he was reading,
nói, thì bác
Uncle Ho
dừng lại
stopped and
và
asked,
hỏi, đồng bào có nghe tôi nói
"Compatriots, can you hear me?"
không? Đúng là cái câu ý nó rất
This
là
simple
đơn
question went into the hearts
giản.
of
Nó đi
everyone
vào
there.
trong lòng của quần
After
chúng
a
nhân
moment
dân.
of silence,
Thì tất
they
cả
all
đó,
shouted,
sau
"Yes,
một phút im lặng,
we hear you."
thưa có thể nói là
And I can say that we did not just shout with our mouths, but with all our hearts. The hearts of over 400,000 people standing in the square then.
đứng ở xung quanh quảng trường. Thì trong khi mà bác
After Uncle Ho finished reading the Declaration of Independence,
thì có một cái máy bay nhỏ thôi.
an airplane, a small one, circled over us.
Cái quảng trường Ba Đình. Thì lúc giờ đồng bào chúng tôi là
We did not know whose plane it
không biết là
was.
máy bay gì. Tưởng là máy bay Việt Nam.
We thought that it was a Vietnamese plane,
Cái máy bay bay
but when it swooped down over us, we recognized the American flag.
thì đồng bào
The
cũng
crowd
rất là
cheered
vui vẻ, phấn khởi
enthusiastically.
mà hoan nghênh.